we need socialism. Let me just say that clearly. We do need socialism, because as the gap between the rich and poor widen, and most of us do not have a college degree, a 4-year college degree. Most Americans make under $50,000 a year. That's just the reality. We need socialism. Mm-hmm. We need a public option. We need our health care paid for. Mm-hmm. We need our public schools to be free. Mm-hmm. What's wrong with socialism?
Well, this whole notion around, again, it's the framing, right? So when you say words like that, it becomes, oh my God, it's the red curtain. It's the rebirth of the red curtain. It's not that at all. But this whole notion around an accountable government. Again, now the framing of those words, those are not different terms, right? So when we say an accountable government, it means simply that the government is supporting the people that support it, right? So if 33% of our income is going to the federal government, then what are they doing with it, right? Is this some kind of pork plan to put up benches in park reserves? I mean, that's nice, but at the same time, we know people are suffering. And this whole notion around looking at capitalism and free market economies, there's this notion that there has to be a sufferer, right? And that's imperative to the equation. And again, how do we actually redress that? How do we redirect that? Because, again, this is what folks are dealing with. I mean, people are not just losing houses. People aren't just being without health care. People are been given subpar schools 60, 70 years. Only a quality education in many cases has only come out of the sheer will of those who have been marginalized to make a tangible push to get this. I mean, nobody is saving anyone. But this whole notion around looking at how when we talk about government or institutional accountability, there has to be some. It just can't be, I give you these taxes and then there's no accountability. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. Now, people will look at spaces like Cuba or the Soviet bloc and say, well, look at all the mismanagement or how poor people really are. But there's some things I think we can learn, especially from a place like Cuba, from a place like Vietnam. Look at education and healthcare. Those are two things that are really critical. And even just the folks to the north. I mean, look at Canada. I mean, this whole notion around, or Germany, or Switzerland, or England, right? I mean, if everybody's feeling the financial crunch, but still look at those state-sponsored services that allow for a broader breadth of people to actually be serviced by the space that they support monetarily.
There's probably a few socialists that's walking around in this building.
Right.
So you got to hook me up after the little talk here. Let me go to my main question. Professor Stovall, is there still racism, good old-fashioned American racism, against African Americans in 2010?
Yes. Let's just make it super. Let's make it
super. Because people think we were a post-racial society. Barack Obama's president. That's
free.
You got Fred Hampton on the. You can't see Fred Hampton way up there. Fred Hampton way up there. Right. Fred Hampton's killed down the street over here 30-some years ago.
Right. Yeah. And it's just the notion of that piece is ludicrous. I mean, it just makes absolutely no sense. Now, we can argue. A lot of people argue, are things better than they were 60 years before? That's a relative question. I mean, we really can't.
Yeah. Well, when I talk about racism, I'm not a professor like you. I can't give them empirical, quantitative evidence that racism exists, but it permeates every institution, from the movies, the television, the public schools, everything. Wall Street, Madison Avenue. Most Americans understand that?
A lot of times, there's experience that allows us to speak about it, but a lot of times we don't articulate it as systemic racism. And what do I mean by that? A lot of times we want to reduce racism to individual acts of bigotry, right? But it's really understanding that there's systems that support that. There's systems that institutionalize that, right? So it is oftentimes the purview of somebody like myself to be stopped on the street by law enforcement because I fit a description, right? So this whole notion around the purveyors or the perpetrators of crime look like me. Now, that doesn't necessarily have to be true, but the idea of how that's informed, right? So black represents in many cases criminality. And when we see that in terms of arrest rates, in terms of stops, in terms of traffic stops, in terms of sentencing, then we have to ask a deeper question. I mean, this whole notion around, I mean, even, the difference, we've been talking about this since the 80s, the difference between rock and powder, the sentencing for folks who are caught with rock or powder cocaine, right? So, or, here in Illinois, with a criminal code, at one time was arguing around actually charging you with attempted murder for possession of a certain amount of heroin. And who are those people? What do they look like? And are, asking this question around, are these groups of folks more prone to crime? That's crazy. But what we have to do is actually look at what are the environmental social factors that actually create spaces where particular activities are allowed and sanctioned. And I think it's really important to understand that, so this whole notion around crime being sanctioned in a particular way, or sending folks, so we talk about not dropout rates, but push out rates. So students who may have had trouble in school, now they may be sending to an alternative system, but this is what we know. If a young person is outside of school and does not graduate high school, there's an 80% chance that they'll have contact with the criminal justice system. Who are those young folks? What do they look like? Right? And are we asking a deeper systemic question around how this is related to race/racism/white supremacy? All right? And folks don't want to deal with that.
We're gonna deal with it. Let's open up the door and see who's at the door here. Come on in. Hello? Come on in. Come on in. We're doing TV. We're doing TV.
Kevin, this is Mark Sibbs.
I wish I had a business card, Kevin.
Sure, nice to meet
And
you.
push that button. Phone going on. I don't care about none of that kind of stuff. That was cool.
Yeah.
Professor, who's that? Professor?
That's Kevin Kumashiro. He's the department head of policy studies, the department that I'm in.